I'm really excited to have Dr. Eric Smith here today, his wife Candace. He is the pastor at Sharon Baptist Church in Savannah, Tennessee. And I don't know how to say this correctly. He was on our short list for our 250th anniversary because he wrote the book on Leland. But we got connected to Montpelier, and so John Regasta kind of filled that role for us in our 250th anniversary. But I knew we had the 250th of the nation coming up, so I said, hey, I'll get him then. And I was so excited when I first reached out to Eric, and I said, hey, we want you to come. You know, John Leland was our second pastor. We want you to come and kind of share your story of that. And he said, hey, I just finished a book on John Broadus. And I was like, I had no idea, and I was so thrilled because if you go to our lobby, we have a John Broadus quote on our lobby, in our lobby wall that says, Culpeper is sacred soil for all lovers of religious liberty and has become a nursery for Baptist preachers. And I've always said that's aspirational for our church, that we would still be a church like that. So he's going to tell us today about his newest book, John Broadus. He's a prolific author, and thanks to our church historian, we have most of his books. Oliver Hart, was that your first main book? The skinnier one. All right. And we don't really care that much about Oliver Hart because he was a South Carolina Baptist. We don't have any use for that. Just like Hans is a South Carolina Baptist. That's okay, but we have that book and then the Leland and the Broadus book. So he's going to talk about Broadus today. Tonight he's going to talk about Leland. Love for you to be at both events. So I'm going to have him come. And we are recording, so don't get up and bump into the camera, okay? All right, come on up, Eric. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Dan, and thank you, Culpeper Baptist Church and community members. I can't tell you how excited I am to be here with you because I've been reading and thinking about this place for many years now, like my entire academic life. It seems like I've been living in Culpeper from a distance. I've actually written, as Dan said, 2 different books about Baptists who had important connections to Culpeper. Both of them happened to be named John. And as he mentioned, the first one is John Leland, who came here as a great traveling evangelist from New England down into Virginia in the year 1775. And he entered into a pastoral relationship with what was then the Mount Pony Baptist Church. As you're familiar, I'm sure that was the original name for the Culpeper Baptist Church. That relationship didn't last a long time because Leland was not really a settled pastor at heart. He was an itinerant. He was restless. He always wanted to be on the move. And so he just stayed gone all the time. You know, it wasn't a good look then, and it's not a good look now when the pastor's just never around at the church. You know, he never answers the phone. You can't get a hold of him. And John Leland was always gone. He was roaming around Orange County and Fauquier County and all these other places trying to save souls out in Virginia, and he wasn't much of a pastor. And so after a few months, they both agreed it would be better to part ways. And Leland later on would say, I was not much of a blessing to the Culpeper Baptist. I had those itchy feet. I was on the move, and it was best that I stopped trying to serve them in that way, and they got a better pastor. But Leland would continue to serve this area as an at-large evangelist for the next 15 years of his life. And he actually would pastor a couple of churches along the way with an understanding that he could stay on the move quite a bit. The Orange Baptist Church is one of the churches that Leland served in. My wife and I passed that on the road the other day when we were driving here. Leland was colorful. He was eccentric. He's a ton of fun to read, even to this day. He just kind of pops right off the page. So I really recommend dipping into the writings of John Leland, which you could find on Google Books, or there's even a volume of the writings of John Leland in your heritage room that somebody might let you leaf through sometime at your leisure. What's probably most important about Leland, especially in this America 250 celebration, is that he was one of the most important religious figures during America's founding era. He's an articulate and forceful advocate for full religious freedom for all people, not just Baptists and not even just Protestants, but for all people. We'll talk a little bit more about that tonight. He was a personal friend of James Madison and Thomas Jefferson. As the story goes, Leland had quite a role of responsibility in encouraging James Madison to include a Bill of Rights with the federal Constitution that enshrined our religious freedoms to this day. Leland is also well remembered for delivering a 1,200-pound wheel of cheese to Thomas Jefferson at the White House in celebration of his contributions to religious freedom. Look, folks, if that doesn't encourage you to come back for the event tonight, I don't have anything else besides a giant wheel of cheese. But right now, I want to talk to you about that other John the Baptist, whose Culpeper connections are actually more extensive, more substantial than John Leland's are. His name is John Albert Broadus, and you can see his photo right there. Does that name ring any bells for anybody? It won't hurt my feelings either way. Maybe no one. Okay, that's good. Then we're not going to waste our time today. This will all be fresh information for you. So John Broadus was one of the most significant Baptist figures and really one of the most important religious figures in America in the latter 19th century. And at least until Dan Carlton showed up about 12 years ago, he was Culpeper's greatest preacher. He's been knocked off the top now, but he had a really good run for a long, long time. So I just published a biography of Broadus a few months ago, so it's hot off the presses. I loved researching and writing that book, and so I'm really thrilled to get to share about him with you. This is one of the first public venues I've been able to give a presentation about him, so thanks so much for that opportunity. So let me just jump right in. Riding home to his wife, Maria, on a Monday morning in 1853, John Broadus marveled at the previous evening's sermon he had delivered. At age 26, the Virginia pastor had already earned a reputation as a dynamic communicator and was preaching out of town by invitation in Stanton, Virginia. Now, I'm just a redneck Tennessean. Do you pronounce it Stanton? Okay, or Staunton? It looks like Staunton, but you don't say Staunton, do you? Stanton, okay. Now, the house that night in Stanton had been crowded to overflowing, according to Broadus. And he overheard one attendee who came to the service that night express his expectation to, quote, hear something eloquent from the young preacher. And yet Broadus confessed to his wife that he felt a strong inclination to instead proclaim the same simple gospel that they had all been hearing since childhood. And the effect of that message was astonishing. Quote, I soon perceived that many in the congregation were deeply moved, he told his wife Maria. And as I spoke of Jesus, the Savior, the all-sufficient, the loving, the only Savior, and warned them not to reject him, not to put off, warned them to flee the wrath to come. Many wept, he wrote. Strong men, they say, and near to the door, where the atmosphere is often so chill, were weeping like children. I trust the atmosphere is not chilly back there with these sisters sitting by the door. But 7 came forward for prayer after Broadus's simple gospel sermon. Broadus, whose sermons would move audiences across America until his death in 1895, never quite got over the wonder of preaching. In his famous preaching textbook, which we'll talk more about, Broadus attempted to describe the pulpit's mysterious power. Here's a great quote from that book. Broadus said, when a man who is apt in teaching, whose soul is on fire with the truth, which he trusts has saved him, and he hopes will save others, speaks to his fellow men and women face to face, eye to eye, and electric sympathies flash to and fro between him and his hearers till they lift each other up higher and higher into the intensest thought and the most impassioned emotion, higher and yet higher till they are both borne as on chariots of fire above the world. Well, then there is a power to move men, to influence character, life, destiny, such as no printed page can ever possess. Well, in the second half of the 19th century, few American preachers demonstrated power to move men and women and children quite like John Albert Broadus. He was born on January 24th, 1827, right here in Culpeper County, Virginia. Though they were not wealthy, the Broadus family was cultured and pious. They had a good reputation in the community, and they combined the evangelical spirituality with Southern gentility that would characterize Broadus for the rest of his life. Oratory, the ability to speak persuasively, powerfully, that also ran in the Broadus blood. One of his distant uncles was named Andrew Broadus, and he's widely considered the greatest preacher in the South during the antebellum period. Two other uncles, William F. Broadus, whose name appears in that heritage room over there, and another uncle, Kentucky Andrew Broadus, who moved to Kentucky to preach. They were also highly regarded pastors. Yet Broadus learned most about the rhetorical arts, not from a pastor, but from his father, Edmund Broadus, who was a popular Whig politician in the Virginia House of Delegates. It was said that no man could whip the Democrats in this time period except Edmund Broadus, a Whig politician. Edmund had these keen relational instincts. He was great out on the campaign trail. He was a really good listener. He could relate to ordinary people. And his plain-spoken stump speeches, I really think that those are what most shaped John Albert Broadus's ability to speak with and to connect with Baptists from every level of society for the rest of his life. Well, in 1843, Broadus experienced a personal conviction of his sin at a series of protracted meetings here in Culpeper. Does anybody know what a protracted meeting is? It's like a revival meeting where they just string the meetings together day after day, and it might go 5 days, it might go 15 days. You never know. It just depends on how the Spirit's moving. So Broadus was at one of those meetings as a teenager here in Culpeper, and he labored under a sense of his guilt over his sin for many days until a friend drew him aside and quoted to him a promise from Jesus, from John 6:37, "All that the Father giveth me shall come to me, and him that cometh to me I will in no wise cast out." Now, that had also been a favorite verse of another great John the Baptist, John Bunyan. We'll talk about him a different day maybe. But this friend quoted this promise to John Broadus and said, "Can't you take hold of that promise, John, that whoever comes to Jesus, he will never cast out?" And John Broadus did take hold of that promise. After he announced his newfound faith, Reverend Cumberland George of the Mount Pony Church, right here, baptized John Broadus in the Mountain Run right outside of Culpeper. Now, that creek's still running to this day, is it not? Well, that's where John Broadus was immersed as a profession of his faith in Jesus. Well, John Broadus was bookish and ambitious from a very young age. As a teenager, he writes in his diaries and his letters about he wants to rise and be something in the world. He's kind of surrounded by eminent people in the public eye even as a child, and he wants to take his place among those important people. And so he considered careers in law and in medicine and in politics. But just before leaving for the University of Virginia, where he was going to attend as a student, a pair of sermons by a Virginia Baptist named A.M. Poindexter completely shattered his plans. After the first sermon, Broadus said he believed that, quote, he had never before imagined what preaching might be. And in the second sermon, Poindexter called his listeners to consecrate their lives to Jesus Christ. Poindexter said, "The greatest sacrifices and toils possible to a minister's lifetime would be 100-fold repaid if he should be the instrument in saving one soul." And that night, after that sermon, John Broadus tearfully committed to gospel ministry. He shared that call with a brother Grimsley, Barnett Grimsley, whose name also appears in your heritage room. Well, Baptists did not require an educated ministry at this time, nor do they do today. And formal academic training was especially rare among Baptists in the South. But Broadus decided to keep that appointment he had to attend the University of Virginia in Charlottesville that fall. The only way Broadus was able to attend, his dad had kind of fallen on hard times because of an economic recession. But his father, this beloved state politician, had an in with, George Cable at the university, and he was able to obtain the position of a steward. It's kind of a glorified residence assistant. And he lived in the Monroe House as a steward with the state scholarship students. And that's what allowed John Broadus to go to school there all those years. Sort of this kind of humbling step for this former politician to take to provide for his son. Well, at the university, John Broadus did very well. He specialized in classical literature and linguistic studies, and he graduated as his class's valedictorian with a Master of Arts degree in 1850. That's as high of an earned degree as you could receive in the South at that time. It was like a PhD degree. The same year, he married Maria Harrison, who was the daughter of his favorite professor, Gesner Harrison. The Harrisons, I think, are a pretty important family in Virginia in the 19th century. And Broadus would remain connected to UVA his entire lifetime. He would be offered on multiple occasions professorships there in ancient languages. He served as the university's chaplain for a period of time and would frequently return to deliver sermons and addresses there. Well, upon graduation, Broadus immediately felt a pull in two different directions between the academy and the church, and he would always feel that double pull. So after graduation, he's sifting through all these offers that he's receiving, and he settles on a dual role back in the town of Charlottesville. He stays in Charlottesville as the pastor of the Baptist Church and as assistant professor of ancient languages, assisting his now father-in-law, Gesner Harrison, teaching Latin and Greek. Broadus has a very successful career at the Charlottesville Baptist Church. He begins to participate in denominational life and carves out a place for himself among Southern Baptists. He writes a lot of articles for Virginia's Religious Herald newspaper. I saw a copy of one of those in your heritage room. He received preaching invitations across the South and beyond during these years. And by the mid-1850s, churches from New York City to California are all seeking Broadus' services to come as their pastor. He's a really gifted preacher. We're going to talk more about why that is in just a moment. So Broadus writes to his wife during this time that he's starting to get all this attention and adulation. He says, "I know that I'm exciting expectations to meet which will require more effort than I've ever made before," he told Maria. "Besides, I know I am grievously prone to overestimate men's opinions of me and am lamentably inclined to be vain when I ought to be humble. Pray for me, Maria, that a little applause may not be permitted to turn my weak head and bewitch my silly heart, in that I may remember my nothingness and my entire dependence for all true success on the divine blessing." I think John Broadus had a lot of ambition to be great at whatever he undertook in the pulpit, in the classroom, and in life. And he recognized, as an earnest Christian believer, that he was prone to pride. And I think that he fought that really in a commendable way throughout his life and sought to remain humble before the Lord, even as he sought to make the most of the life that God had given to him. I think that's something that we can learn from him. Well, Broadus, as I said, quite successful during his Charlottesville years. The problem is he cannot handle the physical strain of working so hard at both the church and the school. Broadus did not have a robust constitution. Someone who knew him said it was like his giant brain was just too big for his frail little body. And he suffered from what was probably Crohn's disease or something similar to it. Had a very severe digestive problem that when it would flare up would completely confine him to his bed. He would have to quit preaching. He would have to quit the classroom. And he developed this habit, even in his early 20s, of retiring to one of Virginia's many springs. I don't know if y'all still have those hot springs around here. He would visit places like Raleigh Springs and others. It was kind of the playground for the genteel at that time. And Broadus would luxuriate in these hot springs, and he would climb up the Blue Ridge Mountains and would talk about how it would restore his body and restore his soul. But that's going to set a pattern for the rest of his life and career. He would undertake these Herculean efforts in the church and in the academy until it would completely break him down, and then he would have to retreat to one of those springs. He would do that until the final months of his life in 1895. Well, it's partly the physical strain of pastoring this growing church in Charlottesville that moves Broadus to accept a new position that sadly will remove him from his beloved state of Virginia. In the late 1850s, certain Southern Baptist leaders want to form a central seminary for training their pastors. That's a relatively new idea for Baptists in America in general, and Southern Baptists had certainly never had a seminary before. Baptists are a popular denomination. They appeal to ordinary folks like myself. As a matter of fact, the reason Baptists have been able to grow so rapidly in the 19th century is that as you see settlers moving westward across the Appalachian Mountains onto the frontier, Baptists didn't have to send their preachers to school for 4 years to learn Latin first before they could go and start churches over there. They could just go right then. They could just carry their Bibles, keep up with the westward movement. And that's one reason why Baptist churches just exploded numerically in the early 19th century. They also just connected with ordinary people with their plain-spoken messages about a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. But at this point, we're talking the mid-1850s now, Baptists are moving into cities. They're coming up in the world socially. They're not getting locked up like James Ireland and Elijah Craig in Culpeper in the 1750s. They're now being asked to pray at the mayor's prayer breakfast, and they're presidents of banks, and they're doctors, and they're respected members of societies. And Baptists are beginning to see that their ministers need more training than they've had before. And so they determined to open an innovative institution. Why was it innovative? Because it would do two things at once. On the one hand, it would offer top-tier training for the really academically inclined among Southern Baptists who wanted to go on to write books and be professors and translate the scriptures on the mission field. But at the same time, it would welcome any Baptist minister who their congregation believed to have been called of God to preach the gospel, even if they had had zero formal training before. And that's what was innovative about the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, is you've got these exquisitely trained ministers who graduated from Richmond College or even William and Mary or UVA, right alongside a, quote, a cowboy caught wild on the frontiers of Texas. And they'd be right in the same classroom together. Well, they called it the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. It would open in Greenville, South Carolina in 1859. And with Broadus' education and his preaching gifts, he was a natural for those who were forming the seminary to recruit, to both form the curriculum, and he would model the curriculum of the seminary after that of the University of Virginia. It was an elective system. But they also invited him to join the founding faculty. Now, Broadus initially turned down that offer to leave the pastorate and join the faculty. In fact, the whole state of Virginia seemed to rise up to discourage him from leaving their state and joining that faculty position. His own church submitted a petition. I think it had 1,000 names on it, saying, whatever you do, you cannot leave our church. I dare say that if I said I was leaving my church tomorrow, we'd be doing good to scratch up about 27 who said, please don't go. But Broadus got 1,000 names. And so initially, he turned him down. And he said, I can't do it. But after a year, he came back around and believed that it was his duty before God. And so he writes to his co-founder of the seminary, James P. Boyce, I tremble at the responsibility of the thing. I am willing to go. May God graciously direct and bless. And if I have erred in judgment, may he overrule to the glory of his name. The die is cast. Well, the seminary opened in Greenville, as I said, in the fall of 1859, with Broadus teaching New Testament and homiletics, that's preaching. It would be the most consequential decision of his entire life. It would shape the rest of his life. Now, his refined Virginia neighbors were not only shocked that he would leave Charlottesville to be a seminary professor, they met in the old Greenville First Baptist Church building. So he goes from just the heights of a Baptist sophistication to just, the cast-off building nobody's meeting in. His Virginia neighbors didn't even think they had clean drinking water down there in South Carolina. They said, how can you leave Virginia for a backwater like that? But Broadus went, and he agreed to teach New Testament and preaching, and they got off to an excellent start in 1859. Really a large number of students for their first year. Everyone's excited. But the second year of the seminary, it's 1860 in South Carolina. What's going on in South Carolina around 1860? Not a great time to start a brand new institution, is it? I mean, we're months away from Fort Sumter at this point. Everyone's talking about secession. South Carolina's the first state to secede, of course. And pretty soon, every seminary student is leaving to go home and either take care of the farm or to join up with the Confederate Army. And so they have to shut down the seminary for the duration of the war. Broadus takes on about 4 country pastorates, and he'll just kind of do a circuit, one each Sunday. But he also does his part in the war effort. So in 1863, he receives an invitation from Stonewall Jackson. Have you all ever heard of him before? I think he's from around here. So Stonewall Jackson invited Broadus to come preach to his troops in the camp. And so Broadus did that in August of 1863. Now, Jackson had already died at that point from wounds sustained at the Battle of Chancellorsville. But Broadus goes to meet Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia in Stanton, right? Not Staunton, but Stanton. He goes to meet them there in August of 1863. Does anybody know what major battle Robert E. Lee's army was returning from in August of 1863? Gettysburg. So it's the most devastating defeat of the war. It's the turning point of the war in the Eastern Theater, of course. And that's who's dragging into the town of Stanton as Broadus goes to meet them. So he's dealing with a lot of wounded soldiers. He's dealing with a lot of defeated, discouraged soldiers. And he begins to not only minister to their needs physically, but to preach the gospel to them. And amazingly, Broadus and other ministers from many different denominations witness a remarkable spiritual awakening among the Confederate troops in that late summer of 1863. Those revivals are recorded in a volume called Christ in the Camp by J. William Jones, who was one of Broadus' students at the seminary. Broadus marveled at, quote, the wide and effectual door that is now opened, and declared that the Holy Spirit seems everywhere moving among us. Well, we'll fast forward to the end of the war. The South, of course, has been devastated, and the faculty questions the wisdom of reopening the seminary. Are we really going to be able to keep this thing going? And while they're debating this, they have a crucial faculty meeting about it. And Broadus is the one who closes the discussion. He looks at his colleagues and says, suppose we all quietly agree that the seminary may die, but we'll all die first. And they make an oath together before the Lord at that meeting to do whatever it took to keep that seminary going. And that oath, that covenant that they made, would shape the rest of Broadus' life. And indeed, everyone in that room would die first before that seminary would die. And it was the defining commitment of Broadus' life, and it ensured his poverty and exhaustion for the next 15 years. Broadus would often go as many as 6 months without collecting a salary. I mean, that's doing it for the love of the game, is it not, Dan? I mean, 6 months having to buy groceries on credit so you could teach a handful of Baptist preachers how to put their sermons together. That really says something. He also kept up a furious travel schedule during this time because he's always having to race around on the weekends raising money for the seminary or doing pulpit supply in a rich northern church so that he could feed his family. The strain, of course, wore on that fragile health. He's often breaking down. He's often retreating to the springs or just having to be confined to his bed because he can't afford to go to the springs anymore. And he receives many, many opportunities during this time to leave the seminary and to leave the South and to accept these very prestigious pulpits, like the First Baptist Church of Richmond, Virginia, for instance, or Fifth Avenue Baptist Church in Manhattan, or to become the president of Brown University or Vassar University. It's so many different opportunities, but he turns them all down to keep that vow to the seminary. To give you just one idea of how fragile the seminary venture was after the war, when it reopened in the fall of 1865, Broadus had 2 students in his preaching class. And then one of them dropped out, and that left one student, and he was blind. His name was William Lunn, and because this one blind student could not do the readings that Broadus typically assigned, he had to develop his lectures far more thoroughly than he typically did. And over time, Broadus looked at those lectures that he developed for William Lunn, and this was a real low point for him. But as he looked at these lectures that he'd written after the semester was over, he realized they could be put together as a book. And so in 1870, Broadus published this 500-page manuscript called A Treatise on the Preparation and Delivery of Sermons. By the time of Broadus' death in 1895, that book had seen over 40 printings. It had been adopted by numerous institutions, translated into multiple languages. In a crowded field, there are a lot of books about how to preach. His book became the new evangelical standard and would, through a series of updated reprints, train preachers deep into the 20th century. It's still being printed today. Most historians agree that this book has trained more preachers in America than any other homiletics manual. That's Broadus' book. Broadus would observe of that experience, thinking back to its humble beginnings. We often find that by doing the next thing for us, even though it be a day of small things, we find the way opening for undertakings which otherwise might never have been planned. Well, during Reconstruction, as I said, Broadus is traveling a great deal to raise money for the seminary and for his own family. And he develops a reputation as a loyal Confederate who yet promoted unity between the sections, unity between North and South. And so he said to an audience in Boston, "We have one country now, North, South, East, West. We are one. God bless the United States. Let us love one another." Broadus' earnest preaching, his conciliatory attitude, and that Southern charm won the hearts of audiences on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line, and he soon received more invitations than he could possibly field to come and preach. The seminary benefited greatly from Broadus' national popularity, especially from his rapport with wealthy business people in the North. Probably Broadus' key relationship that he develops at this time is with a man named John D. Rockefeller. Have you ever heard of him? So he is the wealthiest man in the world at that time, and he also happens to be a devout Baptist Sunday school teacher. And he loved John Broadus. He tried to get him to come be his pastor at Fifth Avenue Baptist Church. They went on vacation together. They toured Mammoth Cave together. They exchanged family photos with one another. It was a very close relationship, and the seminary was very, very grateful that they were such good friends. Well, once the seminary was on firmer footing in the 1880s, Broadus was able to give more attention to his writing. And so he published a critically acclaimed commentary on the Gospel of Matthew that is still consulted today. He's also asked to provide the translation for the 4th century preacher John Chrysostom's sermons. Those are still used today. So Broadus is recognized as a scholar far beyond the Southern Baptist world or the Baptist world. He's kind of globally recognized. He spoke frequently at the Chautauqua Lecture Series and D.L. Moody's Northfield Bible Conferences and Baptist meetings north and south. He was also the first Southern Baptist to be invited to deliver the most prestigious lecture series in preaching in America, the Beecher Lecture Series at Yale University. That continues to be America's most storied preaching lectureship. Meanwhile, Broadus is raising up a new generation of preachers at the seminary, but we'll save that for another time. When his seminary co-founder, James P. Boyce, died in 1888, the trustees of the seminary unanimously elected Broadus to be the second president of the institution. And for the remaining 7 years of his life, Broadus expanded the school's enrollment, increased its endowment, and elevated its academic profile. In these same years, he published an influential Baptist catechism. He delivered some important apologetics lectures on Jesus, the Messiah, at Johns Hopkins University. And he also wrote his own memoir of James P. Boyce and the founding of the seminary. You can find that to this day. So in the spring of 1895, though, showing signs of advanced age and ill health, a feeble John Broadus shuffled into the classroom and offered his final lecture. One student sensed the momentous nature of this last address, and he recorded the experience. Here's what Broadus said. "Young gentlemen, if this were the last time I should ever be permitted to address you, I would feel amply repaid for consuming the whole hour in endeavoring to impress upon you these two things: true piety, true godliness, true devotion to Jesus Christ, and, like Apollos, to be men mighty in the Scriptures." Then pausing, Broadus stood for a moment with his piercing eye fixed upon us and repeated over and over again in that slow but wonderfully impressive style peculiar to himself, "Mighty in the Scriptures, mighty in the Scriptures," until the whole class seemed to be lifted through him into a sacred nearness to the Master. That picture of Broadus as he stood there at that moment can never be obliterated from my mind. Well, Broadus died on March 16th, 1895. He had often told his students that a man born to speak well always impresses us as hearing more in him than he has said, more than words can express. We feel the man. It was true, as his audiences for nearly 50 years could testify. So that's the life of John Broadus. Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about his preaching, if that's okay. Okay, so William Whitsitt was one of his faculty colleagues, and he recalled one of his professors at the University of Virginia trying to describe what made Broadus such a good preacher. Why do people flock to see him? Why does he get all these invitations? He was trying to define the secret of Broadus's extraordinary charm, as he called it. And finally, the man just gave up and said, you know what? He's going to be in the Baptist Church of Charlottesville next Sunday. You just go and hear him then for yourself, and I promise you, you will say after he's done, you'd never heard preaching before until you heard him. Well, many people held this opinion about Broadus as a preacher. Some 15 years after his death, the editors of the History of Southern Oratory judged that Southern Baptists, quote, never had a more charming preacher. The Homiletic Review summed up Broadus' preaching with the word winningness. He had the ability to win any audience. To say that there is nothing to repel would be an absurd understatement, the author wrote. There is all to attract. There is all to attract about Broadus in the pulpit. So what was so attractive about Broadus' preaching? Well, he certainly lacked an imposing physical presence like I clearly have before all of you today. One of his younger contemporaries was named B.H. Carroll. He's a Texas Baptist. He was 6'4", had this big beard. He smoked cigars. I mean, he just filled up any room that he entered. Broadus wasn't like that at all. He was small, neatly dressed. Observers said he had the appearance of a scholar rather than a clergyman. In his younger years, audiences described him as frail and diminutive, though in his mature years, they said he was stoutly built. His shoulders stooped slightly from excessive study, and a thick head of hair crowned his head and his prominent forehead. The Broaduses had these prominent foreheads, we're told. And he normally kept a closely trimmed beard. Well, you can see his appearance there. They said he looked more like a scholar than a clergyman. His intellect and his sophistication were formidable. Broadus could read in 12 different languages. He traveled the world twice and went all over America. So his view of the world was far beyond that of most of his Southern Baptist contemporaries. His experiences were far broader. And yet, the most remarkable aspect of his preaching is that, quote, he was listened to with delight by the most ordinary. The warmth and simplicity of this scholar's sermons never failed to surprise his hearers. Quote, how strange that a young man so well taught in all that the books can teach should use a style so much like that of a mere child, one listener said. There was no gush, no attempt at mannerism or display of learning, recalled another. It was the pure gospel in simple, earnest, well-chosen diction and impressively delivered. Well, Broadus further disarmed his audiences by his modest and friendly pulpit demeanor. He didn't try to be this distant scholar from his listeners. Instead, we're told by the Richmond Dispatch, he has a peculiarly winning smile and attracts by the gentleness and suavity of his manner. He kept his voice sweet. So he's not a ranter. Abraham Lincoln grew up in a primitive Baptist congregation in Kentucky, and he said, the kind of preaching I like to hear is the kind where it looks like a man is fighting bees. That wasn't John Broadus. That wasn't John Broadus. He didn't keep this, he didn't rant and scream and stomp. He kept his voice sweet and measured. His movements were understated. He would draw smiles and laughter by his wit and folksy stories. He would draw tears with his tender appeals. And he explained Bible passages and theological ideas in calm, clear, conversational tones that any listener could understand. Contemporaries would call it a natural method. You know, it's very popular until that time for speakers to use what they called the grandiloquent style. Ladies and gentlemen of Culpeper, I want to thank you today for being, and this auspicious occasion. When Abraham Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address, the other speaker that day was named Edward Everett, and he apparently spoke for 2 hours in that grandiloquent style, the grandstanding type speaking. And then Lincoln comes along and speaks for like 3 minutes, and he gives like a paragraph. It's just simple, clear, conversational diction that's beautiful and that's endured all these years. That's a more natural style, and Broadus' style was often compared to the style of Lincoln's. And so he had this conversational ways of explaining the Bible from the pulpit, but eventually all of his sermons would take a pointed turn. He believed that every sermon should drive listeners to a spiritual decision. In a sermon from John 21, for example, he pressed on the congregation Jesus' question, "Lovest thou me?" which Jesus had pressed on to Peter. Broadus said, "It is a question which I stand humbly in his name today and desire to press home to every man, woman, and child. And I want an answer. And before God, I will have an answer from your heart of hearts. Do you love the Lord Jesus Christ? Do you love him?" Have this pointed turn. Well, in these critical moments of the sermon, Broadus could soar to tremendous emotional heights in the pulpit. He observed after one engagement how there are supreme moments in which all the energies and experiences of a preacher are concentrated with the highest intensity upon focal points. And it is curious how things blaze. Things often blazed when Broadus spoke. He maintained that preachers should feel deeply the truths that they proclaimed. Passion is power, he often said. And he once confided to a friend that he never dared to preach unless he could first spend at least 2 hours in earnest preparation of his own heart. As a result, one of his listeners, F.H. Kerfoot, testified, who was also a Virginian, by the way. Kerfoot said that power went out from him. Power went out from him. When he preached, Broadus poured out the best of his life into his audience. Man, what a thing to have said about you. Well, this potent connection between the preacher and audience was best achieved, Broadus believed, through extemporaneous delivery. That's kind of surprising for a scholar you think is so committed to the careful statement of ideas. And Broadus admitted that an extemporaneous style, so not using a prepared manuscript or notes, he admitted that this did not always yield the most eloquent printed sermons. But he believed that free preaching was best calculated to produce the greatest and most lasting effect upon the hearers as they are receiving it. Broadus said, "Whatever I sacrifice in precision and prettiness of expression, I gain in power of thought and the ability to touch hearts." And that was a bargain he was always willing to strike. Well, Broadus typically prepared skeletons or outlines on a single folded sheet of paper. He kept those on file, neatly labeled and arranged, but he rarely took them into the pulpit. In fact, his daughter tells a story of how he handed her one of his skeletons so that she would keep it for him, and he would be unencumbered when he stood before them to preach. Well, there's many things I think that contemporaries can learn from Broadus, but you've been very patient to already hear, sit all this time and listen to his life and a little bit of his preaching philosophy. Of course, if anyone had any questions, I'd be delighted to talk about him. But I just want to thank you now for listening thus far, and I just appreciate it so much. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.